Check, 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 check. Mic is on, mic is on, mic is on. Awesome. Good morning. Good morning. Grab your coffee, take a seat. Let's get this party started. Awesome. Thank you. Awesome. Welcome. It's day 2. So here we are, folks. Yesterday, I hope you had an amazing day. I thought we had a great morning of content, really interesting panels, lots of focus on AI and strategy, also some great tactical kind of takeaways around performance, which is exciting. Yesterday afternoon was interesting from a weather perspective. I heard that the golf game turned to pina coladas. That was fun. Myself, I was out in a kayak battling the thunderstorm and the rain, as I believe that also the snorkelers were. So we had some interesting weather in the afternoon, and I hope everyone had a great evening last night. So this is our last day. So this is day 2. And we've talked a lot about kind of like leaving stuff behind and being present in the moment, but just kind of highlighting like this is our last final day. So let's kind of be present and drink up like every minute. And so I'm going to ask you to humor me. This may feel a little cheesy, but please humor me. I just want to take a moment to kind of like get centered and grounded around the day. So I want to take 3 deep breaths together. So if you will humor me, I'll ask everyone to close their eyes. Take in a really deep breath with fresh, clean, positive air. And then breathe out. Let it go. Let any negative thoughts, let anything kind of holding on, breathe it out. Okay, we're going to do another one. Breathing in. Hold it. Release it all. Okay, this is your last one. Breathing it in. Hold. Wow, I feel way more relaxed. That was good for me, too. So I hope that was helpful. This is my last ask. I'm going to ask everyone to stand up. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to do what's called an opener. I think openers are just really helpful for kind of being centered and grounded, but also kind of taking in information, which is what we're about to do. So I'm going to ask everyone to just reach up high. Open, reach up high, and open. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for humoring me, and I hope you feel refreshed. Awesome. Great. So, look, we've got a great day ahead of us. So I'm super excited to kick off by introducing our keynote speaker, Christie Hefner. And then we've got a couple great panels around data and agencies. We're going to do a few more roundtables, and then close up the content, and we'll see what the weather holds for us, if we'll be pina colading or playing golf or snorkeling or kayaking in the rain. And then, obviously, we'll have our last fun night together. So great day ahead of us. Super excited. You're going to see a lot of me on stage. So thank you. I really could not be more excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Christie Hefner, and this is really special to me. So I'm going to share some things that most people in this room probably know about Christie Hefner, and I'm going to share some things that I know you don't know that are very personal to me in my journey, in my career with Christie. So starting with, as most of you probably know, Christie Hefner was CEO of Playboy Enterprises for about 2 decades, which made her the longest-running female CEO of a public company at that time. What you may not know was that the company was extremely distressed when Christie took over at 29 years old. We had dinner last night together. I thought it was 35. 29 years old, she took over the distressed company and transformed it from a struggling magazine publisher to a global multimedia brand across cable, digital, and international licensing. So what an incredible accomplishment. So, and as a fearless advocate of women, 40% of the management team were women. So she was really very much ahead of her time around female leadership and diversity. Christie's won a number of accolades. My favorite one is Fortune's 100 most powerful women in the world. Since then, she has transformed multiple other companies. That was kind of the start, including Canyon Ranch. And today she sits on a number of boards across a very broad range of industries, everything from digital and marketing and publishing to cannabis and public good. So she sat on our board as well. So really a broad range. She is a fearless advocate for First Amendment rights, for women in entrepreneurship, and health and wellness. So that's the Christie that you can read about online. And then I want to share kind of my journey with Christie. So a mutual friend introduced us, gosh, it was like a decade ago. We're trying to figure out last night, like, was that like a decade ago? So a mutual friend introduced us, and we had lunch. And I was just starting Public Good. There was no advertising. There was no revenue model. I was really passionate about building a premium publisher network where you could make the news actionable. So you read a story about a thing, and you're like, oh, what can I do to make a difference? And there's a take action button at the bottom of it. And so Christie and I met for lunch, and I talked about what I was trying to build. And she said, I support women entrepreneurs, and I'm going to help you. She walked me into Hearst magazines, into Forbes, and a number of publishers, and that was just the start. Shortly after that, she joined our board. And as board member, we met, I think, twice a month for years. And what was absolutely incredible to me was that regardless of the topic, Christie's advice and counsel was invaluable. Dan and I would talk about, well, what should we talk to Christie about? I think she could help with this, we'll help with that. No matter what we talked about, it was just so helpful. And the eloquent thing is that Christie is willing to have the hard conversations, but she does it in the softest, most eloquent way that you can imagine. So it lands, and it's super helpful. One of those, I was debating whether I was going to share this on stage or not, but when we first launched our brand advertising model, I was all excited, like, Christie, we got these major brands, it's so awesome, blah, blah, blah. But they were like these tiny little revenue campaigns, and she's like, okay, that's great, Melissa, but how are you going to build $100 million business on these tiny test and learn campaigns? What is your strategy to drive growth and revenue? It's like, right, obvious, okay. And then we figured out the pricing strategy. So moving forward, as a founder of a startup, ultimately we wanted to become part of a broader organization, to really scale and have the firepower to grow. And so today I'm here. We're a part of the ad.com family. Literally and figuratively, I would not be here today without Christie. We almost were acquired 3 years ago and it fell through, and she was with us every step of the way, and I'm here today, and I'm part of the ad.com family because of Christie Hefner, and so I am incredibly grateful. My gift to you, I've shared on how incredibly helpful and supportive Christie has been to me over the last decade. My gift to you is that she's going to spend the next 30 minutes with you. She's going to talk about brand and strategy and marketing and share her insights and expertise. And later, we're also doing a women's power lunch, which will be awesome. But I could not be more excited. Help me in welcoming Christie to the stage for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you, Melissa. There's nothing like being introduced by a friend. But I want to thank Melissa, I want to thank Jeff, the whole team, for inviting me to be here with you today. It's a pleasure. I always enjoy the chance to both share my own experiences, but also to hear from all of you through both the content and I'm sure the conversations we'll have over coffee or pina coladas or whatever. But I thought I would start, since Melissa shared some of my business experience, by sharing the fact that when I was growing up, I had no intention or even interest in going into business. My interests, even when I was in college, were in a very different direction. I was interested in journalism, I was interested in law. I thought my career path would be somewhere in that direction. And after graduating and working as a journalist for a year, my life took an unexpected turn. And I'm sure many of you can relate to the fact that you can have a plan and then sort of life decides to take you in a different direction. And in my case, my parents had divorced when I was very young, and I didn't grow up living with my father. He bought his home in LA when I was in college, and after graduating, I went out to visit him and told him that I was thinking about applying to a graduate program at Yale that was a combination of law and public policy. And he was, as he was throughout my life, very supportive and said that would be great. But I wonder if before you do that, you might be interested in coming back to Chicago and learning something about the company. As I said, wasn't something that was on my radar, wasn't something I was thinking about. Business itself wasn't something that was of particular interest to me. But I went to college when I was 17. I was still very young. I thought, I certainly don't have to go right on to graduate school. It's kind of like a junior year abroad. It'll be sort of just an interesting experience to do this. So I said, okay, and I moved back to Chicago, and I went to work at the company. And as one gets the advantage of being in a company that has a founder, I had access to lots of different departments, lots of different parts of the business, and I played a number of different roles, from launching a series of Playboy guides and special interests, to planning the 25th anniversary of the company, to a retail project, to new publications. And then the company, as Melissa alluded to, got in serious financial trouble. It had to do with its licenses in the gaming business in London, where it was the only American company that had casino licenses, and a change in the political environment there as the Thatcher government came in. The licenses got challenged. The company had to decide what to do. It was the only American company and was kind of a target, and so it decided it better sell while it was still a going business, which I think in hindsight was the right decision, except that by selling that business, it revealed that all the rest of the company was highly unprofitable. And so overnight, the company, which had looked very profitable, reported a $50 million loss. The banks pulled the line of credit, the stock plummeted, and the company was in crisis. So I'd been there 7 years, still, to be perfectly honest, not sure that that was what I was going to stay. And the board determined that the person who'd been hired as the president to be kind of the business partner to my father was the person who'd presided over this development of a portfolio of businesses that were not successful, that were simply being propped up by the gambling business, and so was not the right person to lead the turnaround. And that instead the company should do a search and find another outside business executive to be president. Perfectly reasonable. I went to the board and I said, I have another idea. If we do what you just described, it'll take 6 months to do the search. The new person will spend, after that, another 3 to 6 months getting to know the businesses, building trust in the company, to develop the strategy, to actually start the turnaround, and a year will go by. Alternatively, you could name me president. I will form an office of the president with the then CFO, and tomorrow we could start on the turnaround. Now, obviously it worked out or I wouldn't be here, but it was a truly WTF moment. I mean, what was I thinking that without other business experience, without an MBA, that I could step in and lead this turnaround? I think the learning from that moment in hindsight is that, I will share with you, we all know more than we know we know. We're all capable of more than we or others might think we're capable of. And in fact, there's a wonderful book written called Rookie Smarts that's all premised on the fact that often the best thinking comes from people who are new in jobs. And the reason is fairly evident when you start to think about it, because they're the people who say, why not? What if? The hardest thing for organizations and individuals is to keep innovating when you build confidence in what you've done before. So we set about conducting the turnaround, selling businesses that were no longer successful or had never been successful. If I had an MBA, I would say we rationalized the lines of business. I don't, so I would say we dumped the losers. And that took a few years, and then we got the company on a strong financial position. And then the question became, well, where is the growth going to come from? I personally believe there are only two courses that an organization can be on: a path for growth or a path for dying. And you can die over a very long period of time, but there is no managing the status quo in business anymore. So our question was, well, what's the path for growth? What's the strategy for growth? And to me, strategy is the intersection between market opportunity and assets. What does that intersection look like? So we set about to challenge ourselves to ask that question. And one of the key insights that came from that work for me that I carry into all the business work that I do is challenge the assumptions. So the assumption would have been for a company like Playboy that we're a publisher. And the way publishers grow is they publish more magazines. Either they buy them or they launch them. And that was always the way it was. Henry Luce starts Time magazine, and then at some point they launch Money and Sports Illustrated and People and Fortune, and the same with Hearst and the same with all publishing companies. Because that's perceived as your key leverageable asset, is your operational expertise. But we challenged that and tried to widen the aperture, to use that cliche. And what we came to believe was that our most leverageable asset was actually the brand. And if we could think about ourselves not as a publisher, but as a creator of a style of content across platforms, and as the keeper of a brand, that would create vastly more opportunities. Almost like, okay, we were in the railroad business, now we want to be in the transportation business. And of course, it was critical that this was at a time that cable TV and home video were just gaining a lot of traction. So it was possible to imagine that in a world in which the country had gone from the 3 TV channels of the parents' generation to now 50 channels, the potential for branded channels that would be destinations, i.e., I'm not going to watch Gunsmoke, I want to watch MTV, created these opportunities. Now, I said that it's hard to innovate when you have to challenge assumptions, and it is. And if you think about the industry that you're in, or industries, my bet is that you'll think of examples of very successful companies which logically should have been the most innovative because they had the resources, who actually failed to innovate. One of my favorite examples, because I actually knew the people, was Blockbuster. You know, Blockbuster had every reason to be the dominant player in the home entertainment business. But that's not how they perceive themselves. I literally had a conversation with the CEO of Blockbuster trying to persuade him to go into the direct mail marketing business, which I had a selfish interest in because I wanted that channel for Playboy's videos. And he literally said to me, I don't think so, Christie, because, you know, we make a lot of money from those late fees. So what happened? Netflix came along. And the thing I give Reed more credit for than the original idea of Netflix was that they innovated against themselves when they embraced streaming and cannibalized the disc business. And that ability to challenge yourself as to, well, what business should we be in, which seems so simple, is really not simple and really critical. And going back to when we launched Playboy TV, Time Warner was a behemoth. They owned cable systems, they owned HBO, and they had the most amazing brands through their portfolio of magazines. And yet it was Ted Turner in Atlanta who said, well, what about a 24-hour news channel, and launched CNN, where it could have been Time, it's ESPN, could have been Sports Illustrated. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that what you know is not your most valuable asset. Einstein once said, imagination is more valuable than knowledge. And I'm a big believer in knowledge, but I think he was saying something really insightful here, which is the importance of challenging and questioning the underlying assumptions. So we started to build the business around the brand. And part of what you all understand, because you live in this world, is when you're working with a brand, you're trying to understand both what its heritage is, because that's where the emotional attachment comes from, but then what is its relevance in today's market. So we used to say we were building a bridge from heritage to hip. And for us, that meant understanding that the heritage was, the brand meant sexy, fun, stylish, sophisticated, personal freedom. But the hip relevance part, we learned, was that the brand was not seen as a men's magazine brand. It was seen as a brand that was equally interesting to women. And that opened up a whole world of opportunities, from making Playboy TV a couples-oriented television network instead of a channel for a bunch of lonely guys. And it opened up the opportunity to build what ultimately became a billion-dollar global licensing business, 80% of it products for women. That idea of understanding the emotional relevance of heritage and connecting it to the current world is what brands struggle with all the time. And when they get in trouble, it's often that they don't understand who the brand is most salient with. It's why, in my opinion, Nike was on strong footing when it sponsored the Colin Kaepernick campaign, even though they got blowback, because they knew for their consumers that was exactly the right positioning. Where conversely, I think Bud Light missed the understanding of who their consumers were when they ventured out into trying to do a marketing promotion with a transgender woman. So the understanding the who as well as the what is really, really critical. Being willing to understand that you can't play in all arenas and you can't reach all people. And the brands that are the strongest are the brands that understand that. So I always say, not every company is the purest kind of brand. You know, I would say Nike is a brand, Adidas is a shoe company. Virgin is a brand, Delta is an airline. Harley's a brand, Honda's a motorcycle company. So the higher up on the pyramid of kind of emotional relevance and resonance you can go, the more powerful your brand is, the stronger the trademark equity is, the more you can move the brand into other businesses because people self-identify. And it is all about the relationship with the consumer, which, just as we moved from a product-centric to a brand-centric strategy, in today's world, a lot of what you're dealing with is a consumer-centric world. And that first happened because of the dramatic impact of the internet and social media. So as long as communication was one-to-many, publisher, broadcaster, it allowed brands to kind of control the narrative. Once it became many-to-many, a lot of that control was taken away, as influencers had as much impact on the market as brands' own narratives did. Somebody once said that today much of marketing is basically community organizing. And I thought, yeah, there's truth to that, because you're trying to build your community. If you follow the Edelman Trust Barometer, one of the things that's been striking over many years now is that for most people, where they are most inclined to trust recommendations is people like me. Not CEOs, not advertising, not heads of government, people like me. And so thinking about how you interact with that marketplace is really the challenge of the market that we're in today. And it leads us to say, well, okay, if that's the what, what's the how? And to me, the how is all about people. So it's about you, your brand, your style, your organization, your culture. Most of you are probably familiar with the famous quote from the management guru Peter Drucker, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." I deeply believe in that. If you aren't in and nurturing an effective culture, I don't care how good your strategy is. So the question is, well, how do you do that? And I would argue that people who are marketing executives are in a uniquely powerful position to actually impact the culture of their organizations. First of all, you are often thought of as the innovator, the source of ideas. That should be what is the platform from which you can then influence the organization, not just around the next campaign, but around strategic growth and risk more broadly. You live at a place where you could take the leadership role in making sure that the organization doesn't fall into the trap of doing its creative thinking in silos. Silos are where mistakes get made. So when you're doing your creative brainstorming, are you bringing in people from other parts of the organization, not just your own division or department? Are you benchmarking against other industries, not just your own industry? Are you looking at what's going on in Hong Kong, not just what's going on in Chicago? And have you learned how to actually effectively lead an ideation session? I was fortunate to meet someone named Kavis Gobai early in my career and learn something about ideation. And the couple things that I thought were most important were, one, if you put a group of smart people in a room together, there's a danger, and the danger is that people are listening to respond instead of listening to learn. And the way that manifests itself is somebody raises their hand and says, I have this idea, I have this suggestion, and the first thing that happens is somebody else knocks it down and says, well, we tried that, or that would cost too much money, or we don't have the resources, or it's a distraction, or whatever. And when that's the environment, then that squashes people putting ideas out there. Kavis would call those heat-seeking missiles. And he would say, don't send up heat-seeking missiles. When somebody has an idea, if you have some thoughts about it, build on that idea, don't shoot it down. I live in Chicago, as many of you do, and we're the home of Second City. And as you may know, to the point about what business are we in, Second City's biggest profit center is not its shows, it's its corporate training programs. And one of the core tenets of that is something in improvisational theater, which is called yes and. And it comes from the fact that if we're doing a skit together, no matter how crazy what I say is, like, well, what do you mean that we're on Mars? You have to not say, well, we're not on Mars, we're in San Juan. You have to say, yes, and I really expected a better buffet. So that idea of building on, not shooting down, is really, really critical. When you think about effective innovation and creativity, I'll go back to what I was saying about rookie smarts, because the other sort of researched element of this is put some people in the room who are not subject experts. There's actually been studies done that suggest that the optimum number of people to do any kind of brainstorming is probably 7, and that 2 of them should not be subject experts, because they are the people that say, what if, why not? There's an expression that I like very much, which is, if I'm not in over my head, how do I know how tall I am? And that's the idea, is to challenge yourself and put yourself in a situation where others are challenging you. It's also why I so deeply am committed to diversity, and Melissa was very kind in her introduction in talking about work I've done in that space. And I do it because I think it's the right thing, but I also do it because I think it's the smart thing. And it's been studied over and over again that companies that have diverse teams of leadership, diverse people on their boards, diverse C-suites, consistently outperform other companies. And it doesn't take very much thinking to understand why. If you've got people from different perspectives, a diversity of thought, then you're going to get more creative thinking, more creative problem solving. So I think that notion of building a culture around diversity is really, really critical. And whatever's going on with regard to language right now in terms of DE&I, the underlying principles of it have not changed in terms of their value or their importance or their impact. So that's a little bit about the how. And I guess the reason I say that in a very personal context for you as marketing executives is I really do believe that the long-term success of organizations depends on their reputation, and that you as marketing executives are in as good a position as anyone in an organization to be at the center of that. That however much change is going on, whether it's technology or consumer behavior or demographics or competitive landscape, you live at the center of that. You are the people that I think are the best positioned to understand and to represent the balance necessary between short-term results and longer-term brand and company equity and health. And if you don't feel like you're in, to quote Hamilton, in the room where it happens, then think about what would your strategy be to get into that next room. How do you make sure you're perceived not as simply the creator of campaigns, but as the keeper of strategic growth for the organization? And how do you make sure that you're a partner with your colleagues, and particularly people on the technology side? And I know there's been a lot of talk, and there will be a lot of talk about AI at this conference, understandably. And I am not an expert, and I don't have very much to offer in that regard, except I would say this. I think that there's a risk that a lot of money is being invested in AI without a clear understanding of where, if at all, there will be an ROI. In fact, there was a study recently of CEOs that showed that the majority of them did not believe that in 10 years they would see any return on their investment in AI. And on the one hand, you could say, well, okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's kind of consistent with my view that you have to take chances, you have to say, well, why not? You have to invest in new ideas. And all of that is definitely true. The risk, I think, is that resources are going into technology today that are being diverted from investment in human capital. And that's what I worry about. That we're spending time trying to get people to do better things that ultimately machines are going to do better, instead of investing in creativity and trust and relationships that are the uniquely human elements that make us uniquely successful. And again, you, as people that live in this world, can have an outsized influence on how a company thinks about the role of technology and how a company thinks about even the role of data, because we know about the dangers of both the bias of data in and the bias of the interpretation of data. And your ability to have kind of your finger on the pulse of what is happening in the marketplace and how to make sure that you're not falling in that trap of bias is, I think, a really critical role that you play. So I would close by saying that early in my career, when I was starting to recruit for key positions, my mindset was, well, I should find someone who's done the qualities and the tasks of the job I'm recruiting for. So if I'm recruiting for someone to do ABCD, let me find someone who's done ABCD. And sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't work. And then I thought, well, maybe a better strategy is to recruit just super smart people, because super smart people are going to be successful. And I did that for a while, and that's kind of fun, because it's fun to work with super smart people. But it didn't always work. And I realized it didn't always work because they weren't necessarily as adaptable as the times required them to be. They were often guilty of a kind of certainty that is, I think, the opposite of what you need in a turbulent time. And so I ultimately came to believe that the most valuable skill to look for when I was recruiting or promoting to a big job was what I came to call intellectual agility. The ability to be adaptable. Korn Ferry just did a study on of boards, of what did they think were the most important qualities in leadership. And the two that came up at the top were tolerance of ambiguity and adaptability. My view is that if you, as people who have to live at the center of all of this turbulence, can really commit to being lifelong learners, can really commit to being people who listen to learn, not listen to respond, can really commit to practicing intellectual agility and never losing the rookie mindset, then while I won't promise you that it won't be hard, I will promise you it will be rewarding and exciting to be the leaders that you are. Thank you very much.
Great. Christie? We're going to open it up for questions, if that's okay, Christie?
Yeah.
I had intended to let everyone know that we were going to take questions, but I forgot. So
It's okay.
I'll give you a second just to think about any questions you might have for Christie. Great. Matt, my favorite guy. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, Christie. Hi, Christie. Thank you so much for being here. We think a lot alike. So
That makes us both smart.
That's right. Well, hopefully. So you touched on this a little bit, but one thing that I mentioned yesterday was Gen Z is born as early as 1997, so they're 27, 28 years old now. They're not, necessarily all in college. Some of them are still 16. So there's that 12-year kind of generational period. As you think about sort of the generational transition that's going to happen now as they come into a tremendous amount of purchasing power in the next 5 years, what are some, not necessarily like channels or tactics, but what are some principles that you would encourage the group here to think about as we seek to disrupt ourselves and our brands and evolve and set ourselves up for success with the next generation that are ultimately going to be the ones that either drive our brands to tremendous share growth and success, or if we don't do that, die a slow, slow death?
Dun, dun, dun. Well, what I would say is generational change is a constant. So when I was leading the strategic repositioning of Playboy, there was a school of thought that the market should be the men who'd grown up reading the magazine, in effect my father's generation, for whom the magazine represented, as it was called, a kind of a generational prison break, this idea that there was a period of life before you got married and had a family that could be defined as a good life, and what did that consist of? And we felt that we could continue to be relevant to that generation, but that it was really critical to appeal to a younger generation. Or, as we used to say in the magazine business about Reader's Digest, you're going to have a problem if you can't renew your subscribers because they're dying. And that is true for brands where they just can't seem to find a new relevance. What I would say is that one of the keys is to stay connected to each generation by making sure that your own resources, both internal and external, reflect the generations. So one of the things that I was really proud of is I did all employee meetings every year. And I would go to our locations, and I ran them kind of like shareholder meetings, and I would talk about what did we do last year, what are our goals, how do each of the parts of the company work together. I answered questions. But I started each meeting by having people stand up, and I did it in reverse order, starting with who joined us in the last year and ending with, who's been here 25 years or more. And I always felt that I was doing a good job if I had a balance of new people who were coming into the company, who were usually younger, not always, but usually, and people who had built their careers with the company, really represented a sense of connectivity to the past. So part of, I think, what happens that's not helpful is the organization itself is getting older, and it's not bringing in new perspective. I find it very interesting that now boards of directors are reconsidering what used to be, again, a built-in assumption that you never put someone on a board who wasn't probably 60, maybe in their 50s. Now you see large companies putting someone on their board who's in their early 30s, and they're doing it precisely because, whether it's particularly from a technology point of view or more broadly, they recognize the need to get that perspective into the company. So I think staying connected, and as I say, it's both your own team and then what are the resources you use, is probably the most valuable thing I can say. At the same time, I would say this, and this may be something that you and I don't agree on, but it is what I have come to believe from working with a lot of different kinds of companies. Yes, each generation can be spoken about sometimes in shorthand, baby boomers, greatest generation, Gen Z, and sometimes, thoughtfully by researching, what does it value, what is it afraid of, in a way that makes it seem distinct from any previous generation, but at the risk of going into the woo-woo like Melissa did with the breathing, what binds us together is much greater than what separates us. And treating any generation as if it's a, sort of a boxcar on a train, it's probably going to be less helpful to you than understanding the generation, but also looking for ways to make what your brand is and your company is as relevant to them as it was to the generation before it.
Thank you, Christie. So we have time for one more question. Maybe one or two?
I think we should do two, because I saw two hands.
Okay, we'll do two.
First of all, thank you so much. This was so insightful, and I'm very thankful that you're here because I learned so much. My question is really around, as brand marketers right now, I feel like we're all so skittish because we just watched what happened with Cracker Barrel, we just watched what happened with American Eagle, and we're like, oh no, I'm so afraid of innovation to do anything because what's the response going to be? And so not only for ourselves, or even if we are the more risk prone people within the organization, because marketers usually are, we have a C-suite or executive leadership who's not. So I don't know if you have any advice for how to navigate what's going on, but it's a weird time.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I made passing reference to the Nike and Bud Light things as one way of thinking about it, which is the importance of understanding that people do wrap their identities around the products that they buy, and so understanding how people are going to perceive what your message is important. I guess I would have two thoughts for you. One is, maybe more than 25 years ago, I would be investing in message and ad testing. I used to be a little bit of a skeptic of that because I think kind of like creative work via committee, you usually don't get really breakthrough, brilliant creative work if you're market testing everything. It's what's said often about politicians, right? The politicians who seem least authentic are often the politicians that are accused, sometimes correctly, of, polling all of their, messaging as opposed to speaking from the heart. But in this environment, I would definitely be on the side of not censoring the creativity, but of making sure you know ahead of time how an ad or a message is going to be received. And the second thing I would say is, as is true in much of business, I subscribe to the be creatively bold and fiscally conservative. So if you're engaging in something, you need to understand what's the downside risk and that you can tolerate it. You know, there's the old expression, don't bet the ranch. When I was running Playboy, I said, don't bet the mansion. Let's not do something that if it doesn't work, I have to call Hef up and go, I have found you a lovely 2-bedroom apartment in Westwood. So understand what your downside risk is.
Awesome. We had another question.
One quick one. Hi, Christy. I'm Renee Edwards. You mentioned about being young in your career and saying, make me the president. I'm sure that took a lot of risk, courage, and all of the other things. How has that, as a woman in a male-dominated industry, served you well, and what advice, men, women, whatever, do you give to sort of listen to me, you know, kind of I know what I'm talking about moments in your career, and how has that served you?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think for anyone who is not representative of the majority of the culture of the organization, it's important to know whether you're comfortable being the first and the only. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, because honestly, if people weren't ever comfortable being the first and the only, then we wouldn't make progress. But it can be lonely. And so I will often say to people, you know, look around when you're thinking about joining an organization and it's telling you how, you know, they really want you and they really value diversity and whatever. Great, but look around and see, are there other people who look like you who are in the places where decisions are made? And if they're not, then know that you're going to be a trailblazer, and that's great, but it can be lonely, and you have to have confidence that that's who you are. It's kind of like, I remember I was the first woman in the Chicago chapter of the Young Presidents Organization, which is actually kind of embarrassing for them because this was like not 1942, I mean really, but it was what it was. And I was speaking once to a group of the sons and daughters of the YPOers, and these were people who were like in their 20s. And the obvious question came up, which is, should I go into, you know, the family business? And my answer was, I can't answer that. It's very personal. But I can say this. If it's going to bother you that someone is going to say, and certainly think at some point, well, you're only in that job because your father, you know, started the company. If that's going to bother you, then don't go in the family business, because that's going to happen. What I came to believe is that the majority of people would judge me based on what I did with the opportunity. And the people who couldn't do that were people whose opinions didn't matter to me. And that served me well. Thanks, you guys. Have a great day.
Amazing.